It was a cartoon about an older Russian couple, and they're saying, what should we do about Ukraine? And they said, oh, we need to kill them all. We need to bomb them and destroy them. And they said, oh, you mean like in Mariupol? No, 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 no. They did that to themselves. Oh, okay. Well, what should we do after we bomb them? We should go in there and we should kill them all. Oh, you mean like Bucha? We should do that like what you did in Bucha? No, no, no. They did that to themselves. It's like they want these things to happen, but when it does happen, they can't accept that they did it.
All right, so that was a few clips just to introduce you to the people who take part in these interviews. I spent a few weeks contacting and interviewing various people around Ukraine. A few of them are currently living outside of Ukraine, and conservative American missionaries, because in the midst of this war, I've noticed something very interesting, and that is that a lot of American conservatives who most of the time I agree with passionately on 8 or 9 out of 10 issues. I just noticed that they just were completely understanding what was going on in Ukraine wrong. And they would take something like Putin knows kind of how to craft things that makes it appeal to Western sympathies. But at the same time, the way that the Ukrainians here understand the Russian propaganda, I think they make the mistake of sometimes connecting the way the Americans understand it with the way they understand it, because they have these similar talking points, but they are different. For example, the whole Denazify thing, Americans point out, oh, look at the Azov battalion, and there's really Nazis there, but the thing is it's for the Russians, the propaganda there, it's a completely different thing. They're saying that the country's run by Nazis, and the only thing that Russia has to be proud of in its past is they call the Great Patriotic War, when they fought the Nazis. Ironically, they fought it on Ukrainian soil, and it was so weird because in Putin's speech he was saying it wasn't the Ukrainians who fought the Nazis. It was like, well, then who was it? It was only Russians. So he just kind of mixes these truths, and he's like living in the past. He's like stuck in the past. And I mean, there are some true things he says. And at the end of this video, I will give my own commentary on everything here. And I might, may or may not disagree completely with everyone that I've interviewed. But the purpose of this video is just to kind of provide another perspective. It doesn't mean all of us are right. We're all trying to figure this out the best that we can. We all get stuck in our biases. We all look for our confirmation bias. We get emotional about things. Sometimes we don't realize perhaps that our thinking is clouded, and we're limited in the amount of information we have. So we're just doing our best. So the point of these interviews is to provide another perspective, something to consider in your own search for hopefully objective truth. And what I notice also from Ukrainians is, if you look at Parliament, for example, there like, it used to be a lot of pro-Russian parties and then some pro-Ukrainian parties, and a very small percentage, maybe one guy would be from the far right. But you never have like conservatives that aren't pro-Russian with what we would consider a sound Christian worldview, or closer to a sound Christian worldview. And the media here has been overrun by liberalism. And that's what really concerns me, because so while the conservative right in America kind of pushes back and knee-jerk reacts against anything that the leftist media says, the Ukrainians do the same thing with anything that sounds remotely similar to Russian talking points. So these people, where do they find their narratives or their refuge? Is in something that sounds like, kind of views the world through this lens of Russia. And Ukrainians are like, wait a second, we have our own history, our own identity. Our country's been oppressed for centuries. We had Russification forced on us. People are talking about the Ukrainian law is the Nazis are forcing it on people. No, hold on a second. They had language here. Like if you look on Ukrainians' money, there's other ones, but I only have these two with me. This is Shevchenko. This is Ivan Franko. Who are these on their money? They're not presidents. They're writers. Why? Because writers were heroes of Ukraine in the history, because the Ukrainian language for many, many decades under the Tsars and under the Soviet regime, the language and the culture was outlawed. So if you wrote in it, you could be exiled, you could be sent to gulags, you could be hunted or imprisoned. So there's nothing wrong with having Ukrainian as the official language of a culture as a pushback against these, so many years of oppression on their people. So we want to provide just, somewhere the truth is often somewhere it's complex, it's multi-layered, it's nuanced. And so we just want to think through some of these issues. We invite you to join us. If you have some thoughts, leave us a comment and we'll keep it going.
As a citizen of Kharkiv and a citizen of Ukraine, I would say that I didn't see any characteristic of fascism in Ukraine, and I even don't have any, I don't know any person who just have such views, like political or something like that. When we compare, for example, Russia with this clear characteristic with features of fascism, so we could find some of them in Russia.
My own colleague from my cultural center, she spent 3 or 4 days in the cellar or in the garage because they were bombed by Russians. Their house was bombed. Only from the third attempt they managed to get away from this town. So I think if people will speculate about Ukrainians' false flag operation, they should speak to these victims, people who lost their relative there, who lost their houses, and so on, because it's very big trauma for them.
Russian Federation system, Putin system, is deeply rooted in system of corruption. Yeah, and of course, our representatives of government, some of them were under this, were part of this system, and Ukraine was like in this cycle of this corruption, manipulation, and power. So our movement toward European Union, yeah, it was part of that tendency to turn these ties as far as this is possible. By the way, what is funny with Russian corruption, that Putin was building his power on corruption, but at the same time, we see that this corruption greatly lessened power of his army because of corruption. So this is a really good example how could it embody itself in practical issues like army.
If you look at all of the elections in Ukraine, the ultra-rights, so to say, or guys who would build on the legacy of the liberation movement or independence wars from the Western Ukraine, they would get, if they get into a parliament, they would be by far the minority, by far.
His stance on Christianity is it's Russian Orthodoxy or nothing. Many of these people who see him as being on their side, if they were in Russia, he'd be shutting down their churches.
Either we are thinking critical. This was a good lesson for me. Critical thinking is always what we need, and then we will win some moment. And the critical thinking is what also will help us to not make the holy person from Zelensky. Because for me, critical thinking is when we don't have the black and white. We don't have a black Biden, white Trump, or black Zelensky, white Putin, or black Putin and white Zelensky. This is just, I think truth is like, yeah, we need to, definitely there is corruption in Ukraine, if you will ask me, definitely, for sure. And corruption can disappear in one day, but it doesn't mean, okay, in Russia also corruption, let's say this. Putin, one of the most corrupted person in the world. For people who blame, okay, let it be. Let's say Zelensky is corrupted president. But definitely these people thinking about Zelensky, they somehow compare the war, like, yeah, which side to take. Putin, the most corrupted person in the world by the many investigations. There is many improvements about his corruption. So I would say if Zelensky is corrupted, he is probably like a first class and Putin is somewhere like already PhD.
I've heard many of them say they want to just rid the world of Ukrainians, to get rid of, because there's something innately wrong with Ukrainians, and we need to be rid of them.
Zbigniew Brzezinski, who said Russia without Ukraine, it's just a regional power. If Russia would like to be a great power, just world power, Russia needs Ukraine.
There's a lot more nationalism, which is also hard to define in Ukraine. People think of that differently in Ukraine, and I'm still working through that myself, what they mean when they say nationalist here. They don't mean the same thing that we say in other countries or in the West when we talk about nationalism. They really mean patriotism, but there's a lot of overlap there. But I think what really riles Russia and Putin with Ukrainian patriotism or nationalism, whichever may be the better term in individual cases, is that it's anti-Russian. It's pro-Ukrainian. It emphasizes the fact that there is a Ukrainian nation, that Ukraine has the right to exist as a country. It has its own culture, its own identity, and it's separate from Russia. They hate that. And I think they don't care about racism. There's so much racism in Russia that they're not fighting. What they care about is people who are clearly defining Ukraine, what Ukraine is, in contrast to Russia. That's what they want to stamp out. That's what they're really upset about.
Now NATO comes closer to Russian borders. Finland is now in NATO. Ukraine is militarized more than ever. We've took back our cities. Kyiv is standing.
And Mariupol was a wonderful, thriving city. They were getting grants to rebuild. They were building parks. They were building, new administrative buildings. There were people coming and going. It was thriving until Ukraine, out of the sudden, started bombing itself when Russia declared special military operation. So, if people are not friends with logic, or their logic has, gone for a walk, for a long distance walk, then it's kind of hard to say. But I think it's the level of propaganda, because at first they say it's special military operation, and yes, we are bombing them. Then they say Ukraine is bombing themselves. Then somebody else is bombing somebody else, and it just creates this whole chaos in the informational field that makes it harder for people to understand what's going on. Same thing happened with Bucha. First they said it never happened, then they said it happened, it was Ukrainians. Then they said that they did it, but the reason was some crazy reason why they did it. Of course, it wasn't their fault. So I don't know, why would Ukraine bomb itself 32 years later after declaring independence, and didn't bomb itself until Russia annexed Crimea? I don't know. I'm probably not that smart.
I mean, I have compassion toward American people for Biden as a president, because it's somehow a little bit reminds me Yanukovych as the president, because he also was pretty, but he wasn't so old, and the reason was different. He was just dumb. He barely can read in Ukrainian language. So.
Also, I think because of how they took Crimea so easily.
Exactly. I mean, I'm sure if they really knew in advance that it would take more than a year or maybe years for them to do this, they would never step into this. Unfortunately, they really believed that it can be done so quickly. And I think, well,
sorry to interrupt. They also had guys there was 4 guys in Kherson region who collaborated with the Russians.
Yeah.
So I think maybe they thought, oh, we have these guys on the inside. It will be easy for us. Even the mayor of Odessa was pro-Russian, but
I think many people were really pro-Russian, which we maybe still don't know about. I think they had their agents in all regions of Ukraine. But the problem is, and good for us, that they were not really a powerful agents. But I think Kremlin thought they are powerful. Medvedchuk, for instance, they got a lot of money, but technically he did nothing, which is a good thing for us. But I think he was well sponsored by Russia to actually sell this Russian peace idea to Ukrainian people.
Why is it then that our friends who are anti-Ukraine, that are supporting Russia, I've actually heard people say that Russia is doing God's work here. Don't they realize, though, that Russia's ideology is rooted very much in National Socialism? It's not a pure replica of National Socialism. For example, the German National Socialist Workers' Party, Hitler, thought that Germany should rule Ukraine. Putin thought that Putin should rule Ukraine. That makes it a little complicated, because now you can't just walk up to a Russian who's supporting Putin and saying, hey, you're following the Nazi ideas. Well, I'm not. I don't want Ukraine to be under German control, right? Well, it's not a direct replica. There are very similar things, though. There are certain elements of Putin's expansive policies that are based on National Socialist ideas, and you cannot reduce the National Socialism out of it without crumpling the entire system.
I heard the term in the US, systemic racism, but and we can use it. Probably people think the same with in terms of Ukraine, the same with like Nazism and stuff. But they never pass any laws that directly violate or say that Ukrainian race is higher, or that we do not allow foreigners to come, or any nation is higher than any other nation. That never happened. That never happened. And in fact, some say that the laws about language laws. I even heard from Jordan Peterson, the man I respect highly, but his stance upon on this war in particular is absolutely rubbish and crazy. I mean, he said, I remember the quotes when he said that draconic laws about Ukrainian language. What draconic was to have a law that defends Ukrainian language and its use. It doesn't forbid you from speaking anywhere, speaking Russian in particular, or any other language. Hindu students, when they come here, they speak their own language. No one forbids it. The people don't usually, they look at Ukraine from Russian perspective always, from Russian culture, from Russian history, because I partially understand it, because we were part of this whole mess for Russian Empire 300 years, and then USSR 70 more years, and I partly understand it, but we have our own history, and from our perspective, that was that there were unfair laws about Ukrainian language in Russian Empire, and unfair laws about Ukrainian culture and language in USSR, when we had poets and prominent writers incarcerated and jailed and shot dead for writing in Ukrainian, or proclaimed them as traitors, and things of that kind, which never happens in other nations, right? Only in Soviet Union, the trademark, only in Soviet Union.
It's national idea, their national idea, that we are better than everybody else, and we would teach you how to live. Do you like it or not like it, want it or not want it, we would do it. And that's why they have so many wars.
So I say that it's obvious Ukrainians are not Nazis, and that is because we just aren't. We're not trying to put our nation ahead of other nations. We're not trying to stop anybody from speaking Russian. I was speaking Russian all of my life for 26 years, and I'm trying to switch more to Ukrainian now. And nobody ever told me that I cannot speak Russian.
But of course, because all of this is around money, and the Orthodox Church is not like Baptist Church or Protestant Church, which is more about beliefs. Unfortunately, it's more about money, and that's why they need to leave. They cannot gain money in Ukrainian land to send this money to Russia to buy weapons to kill us. That's pretty much all. The church, Orthodox Church, is gaining money, and after sending them to the place where the main district located, like in Catholic Church, they also gain money, and after sending them somewhere. So please don't gain money in Ukraine from Ukrainians and send them to the Moscow. We don't want this. We even trying to not listen Russian music, because on Spotify or YouTube, all this music is converted to the money. And money is converted to the bombs. So we're trying to use only Ukrainian or English music. We don't want Russian. We don't want Russian language now. We don't want nothing Russian. Before we were very pleased, very nice. Now these people are coming to our houses. They literally killed our children. We don't want to know them, to see them, to talk with them. I changed my decision. I don't want to speak this language anymore at all. I feel disgust about Russian language. For all my life, I speak this language, and I was normal about this. But now, after I've seen all this, I don't want to have anything Russian at home. Even my tone is not supposed to be Russian.
I think that this is nonsense once again, that they create to this lie, like to justify what they are doing, because they need something. They cannot just say we just want to invade this country. But what I find really scary, that a lot of foreigners believe this thing. So that we have some neo-Nazis, and that this is the conflicts between two countries because of the territory, and they should not be included in this conflict. But it is, I do not believe that this is true, because Ukraine actually was forced to give up their nuclear power, nuclear resources and weapons in this like an agreement that they will be protected by UK, US, and I believe Russia. But so this is how I think. This is why I think UK and US involved in this conflict, and in that way they are responsible. Because if we would have a nuclear weapon, I do not think that Russia will invade us so bluntly, will try to invade us like that. So they have a moral responsibility, and not only moral, but legal responsibility to do that. Because more and more I keep hearing from people around the world that why should we give our money or weapons to Ukraine? And this is the reason why. Because you left us bare hand. You promised us protection.
Уважаемые граждане России, дорогие друзья, мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима. И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины, а также преданию суду тех, кто совершил многочисленные кровавые преступления против мирных жителей, в том числе и граждан Российской Федерации. При этом в наши планы не входит оккупация украинских территорий. Мы никому и ничего не собираемся навязывать силой. Вместе с тем мы слышим, что в последнее время на Западе все чаще звучат слова о том, что подписанные с советским тоталитарным режимом документы, закрепляющие итоги Второй мировой войны, не следует уже и выполнять. Ну что же, что ответить на это? Итоги Второй мировой войны, как и жертвы, принесенные нашим народом на алтарь победы над нацизмом, священны. В 2014 году Россия была обязана защитить жителей Крыма и Севастополя от тех, кого вы сами называете нациками. Крымчане и севастопольцы сделали свой выбор быть со своей исторической родиной, с Россией. И мы это поддержали. Повторю, просто не могли поступить иначе. Сегодняшние события связаны не с желанием ущемить интересы Украины и украинского народа. Они связаны с защитой самой России от тех, кто взял Украину в заложники и пытается использовать ее против нашей страны и ее народа.
Just before Putin's full-scale invasion on February 24, 2022, he announced a special military operation to demilitarize Ukraine and liberate Ukraine from Nazi leadership, not just Nazis. He claimed they were actually running the country. What is your response to such an accusation and to this so-called special military operation?
I don't know what to say to that. It's just funny. Complete nonsense.
Yeah, it's a funny question, to be honest, for everyone who live in Ukraine, because fascism and Nazism have some characteristic. So we could just compare this characteristic with situation in Ukraine and answer the question, do we have really fascism or Nazism in Ukraine? So, for example, first characteristic, it's anti-democracy, or anti-democratism. So when we see in Ukraine, we could see that we have pretty strong democracy here in Ukraine. And another characteristic of fascism is denial of elections, of democratic elections. So, but we do not have this situation, such case in Ukraine. So other point is white supremacy and something like that. So just do not mention all of these characteristics and points. We could say that if we compare from scientific point of view, description and characteristic of fascism and Nazism and compare with the situation in Ukraine, we do not have such situation. And when actually Zelensky became a president, who is actually a Jew, and it was Prime Minister Groisman, who is also Jew. So it's pretty funny situation from Ukrainian side when people just claim that Ukrainians are fascists or something like that, because it's funny, it's funny. Yeah, so, and of course, you could claim whatever you want. And we see that Russia just used this propaganda when they said just opposite things. And it's like the same Hitler do. So the same situation was with Hitler and Austria. If we read history, so we have the same situation when they blame Austria as Nazis, as a pretty dangerous country. So, and their goal was to protect some population and so on. So,
as far as Putin's Nazi rhetoric is concerned, they have used the Second World War as a central unifying element in both in the Soviet Union and now in Russia, again, especially since Putin's rule, really emphasized World War II. And so when you use these terms from World War II, they carry a lot of emotional weight. So anytime you accuse somebody of being a Nazi, you rile people up in Russia. So it's like you're saying, yes, they have great domestic value. Calling people in Ukraine, or the government in Ukraine, is really what he's done, calling them Nazis. So yeah, that's obviously being done for his domestic audience. Nobody else in the world believes it because there's no evidence. Like you're saying, there is a marginal political influence in Ukraine that is far right, and that presence will be in every country that I know of. I think that presence, a far right presence, is much stronger in Russia, much more influential in Russia than it is in Ukraine. I have an acquaintance, you might know him as well, from Odessa, a guy from Armenia, who lived in Moscow in the 2000s. And I was speaking to him recently, and he was recalling living there and the attacks that people who are non-white living in Moscow were often submitted to just on the street in Moscow. There was a time where there were some actually demonstrations, violent demonstrations against people who are non-white living in Russia. He said he was afraid of his life for much of that time. And as he was traveling to work every day in central Moscow, much of the time he lived there, almost every day he said, or very often, he would get stopped by police asking for his ID because he's non-white. And then he moved to Ukraine, and he says the experience in Ukraine has been totally different. He's not been stopped by police even once. And there's been no violence, against him because he is not Ukrainian. He's not a white person. So from anecdotal evidence like that, but also from what I know in Russia in general, this is a much bigger problem in Russia than it is in Ukraine. And it's interesting. I just think about the question. I looked just online for a definition of Nazism or fascism, which is what it is. At least at its core, supposedly. And here's one definition I found. It's just Wikipedia, not the best source, but it's one source. So it says fascism is a far-right, authoritarian, ultra-nationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy, subordination of individual interests for the perceived good of the nation and race, and strong regimentation of society and the economy. That does not describe the Ukraine that I live in and have lived in for the last 26 years. I do think that comes pretty close to describing Russia. So, when you hear any statement Russia makes about Ukraine, your first question has to be, to what extent is that true about Russia? Because Putin is very good at accusing his enemies of that which is really true of him and of Russia itself.
Man, where do you start with that? It's so ridiculous. First of all, how do you define what a Nazi is? We're talking about something that's sympathetic to World War II Germany, or are we talking to somebody who's a terrorist? Or are we talking about someone who's persecuting Jews? Because none of those that I've seen exist in Ukraine at all. There's freedom of religion. The president is Jewish, part Jewish. There's nothing. There's no terrorism going on. There's nothing like that. Whereas the guy that, you know, Putin, who's coming in, has done all those things. So how do you define what a Nazi is? Just a nationalist? I'd say that's a Russian characteristic as well, that they're just, you know, they're so devoted, they got this cult following to Putin, that they're willing to just lay their own families and their own sons on the line for whatever he says. The propaganda is just over the top. It's ridiculous. They're, I think it was Hitler that said this, and I think Putin has followed up on it, that if you want someone to believe a lie, you just make it as crazy as you can, because the more extreme, the more implausible the story is, the more people are likely to believe it. I don't know why that is, human nature, I guess. But basically, the average Ukrainian, I mean, the average Russian believes that Ukrainians are subhuman. Same thing that Hitler made people believe about the Jews, is that it's okay to kill, to rape, to torture Ukrainians because they're not really people. And, you know, you always wondered how could Germans put up with that? How could they believe that? And then here we are living it again. It's absolutely what's happening in Russia. If you want to look for Nazis, they're pointing their finger at us, but they're living out the definition of what a Nazi is in Russia.
Putin's rhetoric always struck me as being designed primarily for internal Russian consumption. By presenting Ukraine as being run by Nazis, he connected the special military operation to the Great Patriotic War. He called it a special military operation because he didn't want to call it a war, because that would raise questions. Why are we going to war with our neighbor? Why are we going to war with people who are so close to us? But if it's a denazification program, it connects in with important events in relatively recent Russian history, and it disguises what's really going on in a way to make it more palatable to the Russian people.
The more and more weapons are coming from the West, so it's not demilitarization, it's actually militarization of Ukraine.
During his, how you said it in English, demilitarization operation, the level of our military grow extremely high. Our military is much better now than was before this special operation. And our civil life, like civil everything, like apartments, infrastructure is decreased. So with his demilitarization, he helped us to be militarized much more than before the war. This is nothing connected to reality. Like I definitely understand the idea, because unfortunately I grew up in, actually probably can help to mention, because I grew up in a pro-Russian family. And I grew up even being in Kyiv as a capital in 90s. Unfortunately, Kyiv was more pro-Russian than pro-Ukrainian. I grew up in the different scary fairy tales about the Banderovцы and Nazis living in Lviv. And if you come there, speak Russian, they will kill you. So I understand where the idea is growing from, but it's completely nothing similar about the really Ukrainians. Like, and Nazis, in my understanding, Ukrainians very friendly and especially very united after 2014, I think, and especially now. And yeah, like I'm a Russian speaker. I grew up in speaking Russian, and nobody, and this is the main idea that actually all politics were using as a topic to split the society Ukrainian, the topic of the language. I switched to, I know Ukrainian very good. We switched in my family completely to Ukrainian, basically Ukrainian language, basically for kids, just 6 months ago. And I never felt any pressure. And I've been visiting Lviv, as they say, capital of Banderovцы and Nazi, like for many times. And I always felt there as at home. And I'm from my mother from Donbass, she's from the village where you can see the Russian border. So she's from the village that like 500 or 700 meters from Russia, and being there or in Kyiv or in Lviv, I never see that Ukrainians. I have relatives in Crimea. I've been visiting Crimea a few times. Yeah, Ukrainians always were united. And when they were not united because of language, only because of Russian help. So Russia propaganda, it's something that, but it's really left in past. Now I see many Russian and Ukrainian speakers, Ukrainians are united, and we don't need to be liberated by Putin.
wasn't something completely new that he invented at that point in time, because we heard something very similar in 2014 already about some mythical Nazis in the eastern Ukraine that oppressed Russian people there. So it was like the same narrative, but put to a scale. So nothing surprising for me in that regard. But yeah, of course, it's a complete nonsense. If we look at how the members of the parliament are elected, nationalists, I mean like ultranationalist parties, never took more than 1.5%. So I think it states quite straightforward about the support of radical right-wing guys in Ukraine. So, and about demilitarization, Ukraine was pretty much demilitarized to that point already because of the some silly politics that most of post-Soviet countries gone through, and yeah, the military wasn't strong at all. Thank God that we have had an ability to resist the invasion, but yeah, we could do a much better job. And I don't know what he had reached. As up to this point, it doesn't look like Ukraine gets demilitarized at all. It gets the most modern examples of weaponry. Yeah, and it's going to get more. The soldiers are trained with Western soldiers in UK, in Poland, in other countries. So yeah, I think what he achieved was quite the opposite from what he stated as the goals of his so-called special operation, which happened to be a full-scale war, the big one, which Europe hasn't seen since World War II, I suppose.
Sure, I have a question. Where we have those Nazis in Ukraine? Please show me. Maybe our president is Nazi, who is a Jewish guy, whose grandfather was fighting during Second World War as a Jew, that his family suffered. So maybe he could show us some Nazi parties in our parliament. Please show. Yeah, we have some nationalist parties, but they're just small minority, just a few seats. That's all, guys. And of course, sure, he could mention some of extremely radical minority groups who call themselves Nazis somehow. But guys, let's be honest, in Russian Federation, they have even more Nazi groups with swastika, with all of that stuff, and they have those parades, they have those fires, spatial fires, and all of that stuff. So this reminds me about Soviet Union propaganda about United States. So journalist visits United States and he finds terrible house, for example, poor people, and they focus all attention only on this kind of picture. And they say, listen, guys, look how these miserable Americans are living in their miserable capitalist country. Look what it looks like, this United States. And of course, we understand that they just focus attention on something, but they do not show the whole picture. So in my humble opinion, I say the same in Russian propaganda. They could find some facts. They could find even some guys with swastika, for example. But listen, guys, maybe 40 millions or 10 millions or 1 million or 100 Ukrainians have those swastika or something like that. So that's nonsense for me. And by the way, recently, our guys in the Ukrainian army, they captured several guys from Russian army, and they find swastikas on their
body.
On their bodies. Yes, sure. But Russian propaganda said, well, we don't know exactly what does it mean. We need to have some deep investigation in order to find out about that. So that's the different story. So something like that.
In my opinion, he needed an excuse. So, and Russia throughout probably the last 20 years, if not longer, was trying to polarize the world in the opinions of its own people. So Russians are good, Russia is good, but they're enemies outside. And even though we have good relationships with them at the moment, the time will come when they will not be so friendly and they will try to assault. So even though Russian people, not just in the large cities, but in the villages, they would use the benefits, and not all, use the benefits of the Western civilization, quote unquote, they still would treat West with caution. viewing them as enemies. That's somewhat of a leftover, I guess, from the Soviet Union, especially in the minds of people who live in a rural Russia, so to say. So for them, the fact that, oh yeah, NATO pumped weapons into Ukraine and NATO has a lot of military bases, that all fit the narrative that they've been hearing for years. So it was of no surprise. That was probably the news was greeted with tremendous joy. Oh, finally, we're not going to wait. We're just going to respond and retaliate. And then the Nazi, you know, when I was a kid, we played games. I don't know whether you played those games in America. Maybe it's not politically correct, you know, like cowboys and somebody else, and you chase each other to opposing sides. In Ukraine, we played Cossacks and bandits, or Soviets and Germans or Nazis. So that was a derogatory term, and the term that would resonate very well with a negative connotation whenever you use it, pretty much with everybody. And so when he said we'll go demilitarize and denazify, the large portion of the population in Russia would be like, yeah. And that was the message, I don't think so much to the world, even though it was broadcasted all across the world, as it was for Russians. Because how do you explain the campaign against a country where Russians have so many relatives, so many Ukrainians live in Russia, etc. So yeah, let's use two bad words, militarization, that supposedly Ukraine was going through, and then Nazification, which was absolutely absurd if you look from the Ukrainian standpoint. At the time, I believe, of the assault, or prior to the assault, no, sorry, shortly after the elections, both president of Ukraine and the prime minister, they were Jews. And that's in a supposedly Nazi state. It's absurd. So president is a Jew. Zelensky is a Jew, as much as we know, and he was elected by 73% of the votes, or so somewhere there. So yeah, it was just, it didn't make any sense in Ukraine, I don't think, to anybody, probably except for the people who were sitting and watching Russia's propaganda. But I think even if you were to ask them, do you think that Zelensky is a Nazi? I don't think they would say yes.
Well, after I have heard about it and saw his small part of this of his announcement, I would say, I found it ridiculous, and I also understood that it is the beginning of the war. But still, these words about denazification, demilitarization, and so on, it was the information for his own people. Primarily for his own people, because he needs wide support of the Russians, and I think that he achieved his aim, also because he's more than 20 years the president of Russia. He came to power, I think, 1999, and he was all the time the president of Russia, except 4 or 5 years when he was the prime minister, and he set Medvedev as a nominal president, but still he governed Russia. And I think during this time he developed the Russian propaganda so that people were brainwashed, and the fact that he announced this special operation was just, I think, normal for the people in Russia. They were only comparing with all the population of Russia, only a small amount of people who went on the streets to protest. They were all seized and brought to the prison and so on. So I think that the great majority of Russian population is brainwashed by Russian propaganda, and this information about special operation, it was kind of it. So for me, well, for me, it was the war announcement. He could not tell the whole world that it is war, but he just has chosen the right words to do it, actually. And I think he was pretty sure that he will occupy Ukraine or Kiev in 3 days. That's why he called it special operation, because he was thinking about small period of time, like, okay, 3 days, okay, maybe 1 week, maybe 1 month, but not 1 year or more.
Yeah, like you're saying, Stepan Bandera is a very controversial figure, but in my experience, people generally do not know their history that well, and they don't know his history very well. He is just a figure around whom people unite because he fought the Soviets, who were invaders. They invaded Western Ukraine, he fought them, and it's around that part of his identity that people unite. People are not uniting against the part of the story of Poles being killed, which, as far as I know, when that was happening during World War II, he was in a concentration camp. He wasn't part of that actually happening. I don't know if he supported that or not, but that is not what people identify with when you talk about the resistance movement. There, as far as I know, there were many Jewish doctors working with the resistance movement, so it was not clearly a racist organization. As far as I can understand, Stepan Bandera and the people who were part of this organization, they were fighting for Ukrainian independence. And as in the centuries before that, like the Ukrainian Cossacks, they were fighting against everybody who would threaten that independence, whether it were, the Nazi Germany's eventually they came to fight against them, whether it's Poles, whether it's Russians, whoever it is, they were trying to establish their own independent country.
So we don't have like Nazi regime in Ukraine, even though there could be some individuals who could share this ideology, as probably in any country which existing, but it is not the majority even near. It's the low minority. So, and this claims it was just, just some reason to start this invasion, which basically was not for even foreign countries, which was for the citizens of terrorist state Russia. And now what we have in the result, like the patriotism of Ukrainian people is much higher than it was before. We have lower pro-Russian people, and we have much more weapons than we have in the beginning of this full-scope invasion. And special operation is also, of course, not a real term because it was war, which like not even started at this time, it starts much earlier. It was just full-scope invasion or so-called escalation of the war. And we should understand that not everybody from the Azov battalion were far-right Nazis at first, even in the beginning. And second, for example, the right sector, which was very popular on Russian television, probably even more than in Ukraine, they claimed that this is Nazi organization. And then we had like a bunch of photos. I think you could find it in the internet, like maybe even videos with people who are Jewish or Hasids, Orthodox Jews who served in this battalion. So it's kind of like ridiculous claim. It never could be possible that in a Nazi organization who support this ideology, they would accept somebody who is an Orthodox Jew. And there are some individuals who could have this ideology, and they just make them popular and focus on them. But we also have some evidences that many people who have the same kind of right ideology fight on the Russian side. And they have also a lot of Nazis in their army. And I would say that this far-right Nazis movement even more popular in Russia than in Ukraine. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And the other thing, of course, that their ideology and their claims about Ukraine could be also viewed as a variety of Nazism and its others. And that their first goals was Denazification, and Demilitarization. But as we've seen this, when they actually reveal their goals, and there are a few public statements when they say that they want to annihilate Ukraine as it is, and Ukrainian people. There is no such nation. And we also have evidences that they have these mobile crematories to burn bodies. And they bring this stuff with them when they start invasion. And there is a question why they would do it, for what reason they would do it. And as a result, we know that they burn a lot of their bodies of their soldiers in that crematories, but also probably it was for the people who are Ukrainians. So basically it was genocide. And I don't think that it's much better than neo-Nazi Germany, or than Nazi Germany, pardon me, back then. I think the ideology is very similar, claims are very similar, and the basic methods are very similar. And this lie about their goals and about what horrible things Ukrainians are doing, usually it works just vice versa. They claim something that they are doing, and they blame it on Ukraine. Yeah, I would say that the primarily reason and decision was made by him, but also it is confirmed by many poor choices of many people who live there and who believe in the more or less same narrative as he, the narrative of great nation, of like special nation. Then there was a interesting joke. It probably was after 2014 when they said that they have one more chromosome in the DNA. Haven't you heard it? They said it on the TV that Russians have one more chromosome special, which like make them special. So how it's different from Nazis who try to measure how big is the skull of person and somehow define who he is.
Liberate from Nazis, right? Okay, brief answer would be utter rubbish. A bit longer answer would be we probably have as many Nazis as in any other nation, in terms of percentage-wise. And there was no Nazi to liberate us from. I mean, look at our parliament. There's no Nazis there. Only Democrats, even pro-Russian parties are represented until the war started. I mean, we had a whole variety of communists from left to right until they started stir trouble. So I guess you can write it off the band right away, because just, yeah, have a look at our parliament, have a look at our society, tons of international students, tons of tourists before the war. I mean, did anyone felt discrimination? I doubt that. There might be any like single cases of that when a terrorist went to a region of a city with bandits, but this is definitely not the majority of population. Definitely no political parties of Nazis. Some individuals, yes, not even 5%, I'd say. A couple of things about Svoboda. It's really interesting. I do believe we need to distinguish between Nazis, nationalists, and patriots, because there's three different groups of people. I think most of the conservative population in America are considered Nazis by the liberals, right, or by the progressives and other lefties, and it's not the case in Ukraine. Second thing is that Svoboda is not represented anywhere apart from maybe a couple of local cities. I'm sure Ivano-Frankivsk city regional council. There are a couple of deputies, and Lviv maybe. But have a look again. Have a look at our parliament. I think there's only one guy from Svoboda that actually was elected to our parliament among 450. Do people really think that he has any power to to stir some troubles in the parliament, or to pass any laws, or do any Nazi stuff? I mean, it's highly impossible. 1 in 450 representatives.
I would say that Russians just use this as an excuse to start the war. It was never the truth for me. I was born during the Soviet Union, and I have never had a problem like speaking or talking Ukrainian, learning Ukrainian. But I know that it was forbidden, and my grandparents told me about the several famines that were in 1930s in Ukraine. So they were not actually they didn't support the Soviet Union state government, and I haven't seen any Nazi in Odessa, or I haven't heard about anything that awful that is portrayed on the Russian television. I think it's more of the legend that they are trying to push, and as I said, to justify the reason why they invaded Ukraine.
So as a strategist, I think that was a wise way for Putin to frame his evil acts that he's doing. At any moment now, right, all that Putin has to do is say, look at Ukraine. It's not being run by Nazis anymore. We've won. We can go home, right? because there were never any Nazis in Ukraine to begin with. I say there were never any Nazis. There's always, every country has its white trash, right? I'm from Texas originally. We have the Ku Klux Klan in certain areas. You know, Vidor, Texas, down south is very famous for having a bunch of Ku Klux Klan white trash. You know, there's the presence of the white trash Ku Klux Klan in Vidor, Texas, which, by the way, is not all of Vidor. There's some good believers down there. Does that justify attacking Dallas, Texas? No, absolutely not. Well, likewise, in Ukraine, every now and then you'll come across someone that's got like a stupid Nazi tattoo. You see them every now and then. If one of them gets arrested if they get captured in the war, they'll always take pictures, plastered all over the place. Zelensky is Jewish,
right?
Nationally or ethnically Jewish. He's not a practicing religious Jew, and he was selected by 60% of Ukraine. He's got more support of Ukrainians than any American president has had since Reagan, probably. So there's that.
When we talk about Nazis, it's also the part of the history which was back then during Second World War, and its history both touches both Ukrainian and Russian people. And it's understandable that when people recall Second World War or they recall what's happened in there, they are afraid that it could be repeated. So that's why Russia used it in order to justify their military action, justify what they are doing. And they try to justify it in a way that they call us, name us as an evil which known by everybody from the previous history. They said like that we are this evil nowadays. And it's just the way to justify their crimes which they're doing. And basically also one more point about Azov. It's interesting that people who are in so-called DNR and LNR were really like disappointed because these soldiers were there. They were captured. After they were captured, they like really put them in the cages as the animals. They said that they will execute them, and they even make some like type of court, so-called, that said that there should be death penalty for all of them. And then they make this exchange, and these local people were disappointed because they wanted to see how they would be killed publicly.
First of all, I would like to say that it's not a special operation. It's a real war, because not only military is gained in all of it, but mostly just regular people. And I can say that there were never Nazis in Ukraine, although the state language is Ukrainian, but about a third of the population spoke Russian fluently. Me too. I personally spoke only Russian about 30 years, and I never felt any oppression anywhere because of the language or because of any national issues. I have never seen any Nazis. I have never felt anything like this. I traveled all around the Ukraine, so I think it's just the reason to kill people. That's all. What I can say that the right sector, or how they call themselves, for me, from my point of view, I used to work 3 years for government, and these people were all around, if I can say so. These people were just about freedom. Even though we spoke Russian, we didn't feel any pressure. That's first. Azov, it's not Nazis. Azov is just like special forces. It's people in military who are special trained, not regular soldiers, but like Marines, for example. And these people are, they have nothing to do with nationalism. This the first military group who went to defend. They were the first. When others didn't know anything about military, the army wasn't popular, if I can say so. The Azov, they took soldiers from sportsmen, from special strongmen, if I can say so. And yes, those people were fighting for freedom, but not nationalists. It's governmental structure, if I can say so.
We never tried to capture anything because, and of course, Russia too, we were not trying. Even if we had such a desire, we would not have such power because Russia has so much more resources. Even if we had the same amount of vehicles, military vehicles and guns and everything, they just have so much more people, and it would be impossible for us. So this is a narrative that Russians are always talking about, because they need to explain their people why in the world you have to go to the other country to fight there. And this is a Russian narrative that they have been using for a long time now, since like 2013 or 2012 something. And they were saying that there are Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, and Ukrainians are not treating them well. And that's why we need to help them. We need to capture Ukraine and to free these people, blah, blah, blah. That's not true. I remember I saw an interview of a Russian minister, and he was saying, it's very hard, that's like a quote, it's very hard to walk in the center of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and talk Ukrainian without like feeling pressure. This is such a lie. I'm studying in Kiev in the seminary. I've been to Kiev many times. I was speaking Russian every single time when I went to Kiev, and this never ever happened to me. There, in all my life, I only once I got into such a situation. I went to Lviv. Lviv is like a western big city in Ukraine, and I was speaking Russian, and some man told me like you should speak Ukrainian something because of the history of Ukraine, and because in the West, I would say Russian language is not very appreciated. But he was not making me speak another language. He was not trying to beat me or do anything. He just like told his opinion about me.
Well, I think because the past that time 8 years, now it's already 9 years. If you ever watched or switched on the Russian TV, one of the biggest things they were always talking about and discussing between them and selling this idea to Russian people who were watching TV was one of these statements that Ukraine doesn't allow people speak Russian language. So it was important to show to them that on all these Russian-speaking territories, like Kharkiv region, Donetsk region, Lugansk region, Kherson region, and they were also trying for Odessa region, people are suffering from not being able to speak Russian, from not being able, I don't know, to study Russian in schools and so on. So this first idea of Denazification is sort of like these Nazis who are not allowing them to speak Russian language, Russian people, ethnically Russian people. So I think this is the first idea which was put behind this term in Nazification, which was truly speaking, of course, not the truth from the very beginning at all. And I have a good example in my own family because my mom and my dad, they are originally from Russia and Belarus, and they moved to Ukraine, to Odessa in particular when they were 23 and 26 years old. So even now, actually, they don't speak good Ukrainian, unfortunately. But from other side, they demonstrate the fact that they were not, that was never even a thought that among any people in Ukraine, you cannot speak Russian language or any language, actually, which you want. So that was the first one. And demilitarization, I think that was exactly what we were discussing before. Like Ukraine was also sailed to Russian people as hub of USA, or maybe also some European countries, hub for weapons. So their idea was to take away the whole weapons from Ukraine. And I think they were not afraid of the consequences and also thought that it would be really fast because they knew Ukraine doesn't have any nuclear weapon. And also they probably believed that Ukraine doesn't have a strong army. And I don't think they were expecting that Ukraine will be supported that much. So that's what I see lays behind these two terms.
The Russian Empire began to control part of Ukraine in the 18th century, basically abusing this agreement that was made in the 17th century, just with an alliance with Russia. The Cossacks in Ukraine had been making alliances with all three powers in the region, Poland, the Ottoman Empire, and Russia throughout the centuries as they were trying to, get one to help them fight against the others. But when they made this alliance with Russia, Russia starts taking this as an excuse or a door to say Ukraine belongs to us. And they only took the part of Ukraine that is the eastern shore of the Dnipro River. They never had all of Ukraine. Western Ukraine, as you know, was never even part of the Soviet Union until 1939, when Stalin and Hitler made their agreement and they divided Poland up. And that's when the Soviet Union invaded and took Western Ukraine. So that was never part of the Russian Empire at all. So there's absolutely there's no way Russia can say that Ukraine is historically theirs. You cannot go back to history and say because a foreign power has owned a certain piece of land for a certain period of time, that foreign power therefore has a right to it today. And if you look at Ukraine's history, Ukraine is a very interesting country. I mean, you have to admit it. Since Ukraine has existed with its borders since 1991 for the first time in history. So it is a country that has different territories that have different histories in and of themselves. So it's very hard to talk about, you can't really talk about a united Ukrainian history. And it's been one of the challenges in this country is to develop its own identity. What does it mean to be Ukrainian when we are all different people? You know, and I think with this war, Putin is doing even more to unite Ukrainians. So he really is fighting against his own purposes. But if you look at the history of Ukraine, most of Ukraine has been under or was under Polish rule much longer than it was under Russian rule. So if any country could use this kind of logic and say, we have a claim to Ukraine, it would be Poland or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, not Russia. The south of Ukraine was controlled by the Ottoman Empire to a large extent. You know, areas in Transcarpathia were controlled by Hungary and other countries there. So yeah, what are you going to do? Are you going to divide Ukraine up, or are you going to say, Ukraine exists today, people in Ukraine understand who they are, why they exist, and we will let Ukrainians, this sovereign country, decide what they want to do, who they are, and how they want to rule themselves. I think, you know, there's been too much of this attitude in the world that the United States decides what happens with Ukraine, Germany decides what's happened with Ukraine, Russia decides what happens with Ukraine. All these other countries get to define the narrative about Ukraine, and nobody's saying, well, how about Ukraine? What do Ukrainians want? They have a right to exist. This is a country of, you know, has been over 40 million people. It's the largest country in Europe, not counting Russia. You know, so I think people need to change the way they look at Ukraine and give Ukraine the right to exist and the right to decide for itself who it is. One interesting point along that line of thinking is, you know, with World War II, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, but the country that exists today that suffered the most is Ukraine. Ukrainians died in much larger numbers than Russians because Germany came through all of Ukraine. It took all of Ukraine and took only part of Russia. However, you know, in the years after World War II, especially after the Soviet Union broke apart, the communication about World War II has been between Germany and Russia. So Merkel goes to Moscow on the 9th of May. She doesn't come to Kiev. You know, nobody's talking about Ukraine having been destroyed by the Nazis and the Germans during World War II. They're talking about the Soviet Union or Russia. Russia has taken that identity upon itself. So again, Ukraine is, and its existence is ignored.
So in Putin's speech, you know, like I said before, he's kind of stuck in the past. He's talking about World War II and fighting the Nazis. And it's kind of like, I feel he's accusing the West of encroaching upon him with their empire of lies. He said this in another part of that same speech that I cut out, but he's actually right. The West has lied. The West is encroaching upon Russia's borders. The West is using Ukraine, in my opinion, to weaken Russia. They are trying to be sly and weasel in there. What frustrates me is they talk about NATO, 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 but then don't do it. And in December 2022, Putin said, give me a guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO. You know, it was 2008, early or late 2007, when they were talking about Georgia and Ukraine joining NATO, and it was a few months later, they invade Georgia. Because if they're at war and they're destabilized, they're not going to be able to join. And to this day, Georgia has not joined NATO. So he's like, okay, you know, I think ultimately, like, people say, oh, he's a liar, so they just don't believe anything he said. They're like, it's not about NATO, it's he's a psycho, or he's an egomaniac, and he's a imperial ruler in his own mind, and he just wants this Grand Slavic Empire. That is true. But none of these things contradict that. The fact that he wants oil that Crimea has, or the Donbass has, or the other resources that are there, because if Ukraine has them, that makes them independent potentially in the future, to be more financially independent of Russia, so Russia can't blackmail them anymore. And the expansion of NATO towards Russia's border, that also encroaches upon Russia's hopes for a Grand Slavic Empire. So none of these things are contradictory. They're all true at the same time. And all these kind of small objectives are serving his one big objective. And anything that threatens that, he doesn't like. So I don't think he's lying that he's upset about NATO getting closer to Russia. But at the same time, it's just so ironic that he's accusing the West of being this empire of lies to expand their power. Well, he does the exact same thing in a different way, and he's frustrated because he's losing. So he feels backed into a corner, and I guess he felt like it's now or never. I think what he should have done is get his head stuck out of the past and saw what the West did well, and he had so many resources instead of having this oligarchical kleptocracy thing, this basically kind of glorified mafia ruling Russia, where they just stole from all the people, made it so that no like upper middle class or middle class could really form. They could have done things, different economic structure. They could have made it prosperous there. He could have served the people, not just himself, and created a different democratic structure. He could have done it even better than the West. If he really wanted to show the West Russia was so great, then what is he doing? He's just shooting himself in the foot, and nobody wants it in Ukraine. So now what Ukraine is doing is they're running into the arms of the West, but they're completely naive to the way the West is actually using them. I mean, look how many people have died because the West was doing this to Putin, knowing what he would do in response, knowing he had 3 borders of Ukraine surrounded by soldiers, and refusing to comply with his requests, refusing diplomacy. Yes, he's lying about what happened in Crimea and Donbass. Absolutely. But I just think there could have been another smarter way from his side. And on the other side, well, I personally believe that what they're doing is in alignment with their kind of globalist agenda. So in this address, Putin, he's mostly talking to the Russians, and he had to be consistent because he's been talking about this Nazi regime since 2014, and he calls it a special military operation because he thought it would take just a few days. And so this is his way of basically trying to make the Russian people kind of understand what he's doing there, but it's all just a complete lie. So he thought, okay, the West has been equipping Ukraine with weapons. We're going to go in there, force them to lay their weapons down, and put our own puppet regime in on Ukraine and stuff. Yes, there were other battalions who committed war crimes against Russians in the Donbass region, but most of the war crimes committed there were by separatists or Russians. You can look up this information yourself. Things happen. I'm not excusing anything that happened, but he only focuses on what Ukrainians did. He blows it out of proportion and completely ignores what the Russians have been doing there, which is it's just absolutely horrendous. So yeah, so I lived in Ukraine for over a decade. I've met hundreds, maybe thousands of people. I never personally met somebody who was considered themselves a neo-Nazi. I've seen them on the news here or there. There are a few of them running around, but not any more than is any other country in the world. And actually, Russia has a greater problem with this. So, like I said, they just take one little piece of truth, they just blow it out of proportion, and Russia just says the craziest things. I mean, like for the Biolabs stuff, for example, they say, oh, there's Biolabs there, they're creating bioweapons, and that's kind of the narrative that they float over to the West. But the one that they put for Russia is that they actually said it in the United Nations, but for some reason Tucker Carlson or nobody wasn't talking about this because it's so far-fetched that they were, making mosquitoes that bite only Russians or pigeons or something. Now, like if you go back to Vietnam, there were cases where America did put some kind of disease in rats and let them loose in Vietnam. So it's actually not too far-fetched to think that they would put some kind of biological weapon in an animal and let it loose in the country. But was this happening? There's no evidence of it at all to this date. Nobody's seen any pictures of any destroyed biolabs. The West takes a little piece of what Russia says and they kind of present it in a more packageable way over there. And then the American conservatives are like, oh, there's biolabs there. Remember COVID. Oh, Ukraine must be involved. But there's no proof. It's all speculative slander. They connect this dot and connect that dot when they have zero proof. Yes, there's biolabs here. They're, trying to keep people healthy, to fight contagions and stuff like that. Maybe there's 1 or 2 labs that is doing some experimental science. Who knows? But it's all speculation. And if you don't have proof, it's slander. So I think that's just something that Christians should think about. You should kind of say, okay, here, this is create different buckets. This is very likely, or this is a little less likely. This is maybe. This is absolutely no. Or over here we have proof. We have a smoking gun. We have a lot of corroborative evidence or whatever. So you make these different buckets and you put it in there, and you have to make logical connections of correlation and causation that this must equal this, not this could equal this. And if it only could equal this, then you have to say, well, it could also equal maybe this, and make a list of the possible things that it could mean. Then your accusation is only one of several possible theories. So I think people need to think through these things a little bit more carefully before they continue slandering people and they know nothing about the place.